when I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to say about Alan and the relationship that he and I had was, I would say from our childhood, he was probably the cousin that I was the least closest to. But as we became adults and we grew older, he was probably the cousin that I became the closest to. Three things really stand out. The first thing was that, he spent a lot of time with my dad. When my dad had his company on Fulton Industrial, and him and Kim would come over and eat lunch. And I know that he was very close to my father. And I know that my dad really loved Alan and appreciated the time that he came and hung out with him. And Alan's one of the few people that when we got together, I could talk about my dad with, because he was one of the few that's still around that actually knew my dad, spent a lot of time with him. When Alan and I got together, we never had any problems talking about anything. I mean, we always had free conversation, and I always look forward to the time that we got to hang out and spend with one another. Which kind of leads me to the second thing was, he was huge into racing like I was, so we'd always talk about that, cars, and him going to Road Atlanta, watching motorcycles and all that kind of stuff. We talked about a lot of that stuff forever, but I'd say probably one of the last times that I was out at Road Atlanta racing or whatever, and Alan had moved back, he came up and stayed in Aunt Barbara's car and came out to the racetrack and hung out with Richard and I like the whole weekend. And it was just so easy because he knew where we were in the paddock, and he'd come over and he'd hang out for a while, and then he'd go back and he'd go do his own thing. Like, he was so comfortable. He didn't ever have to be somewhere. He was comfortable with himself and would come and go. So he'd come hang out with us. We'd just have a good time or whatever, watch cars and everything, and then he'd go back, and the next morning he'd come over, and that was just a good, I think we had a test day and weekend. It was just a good time to see him and spend quality time with him there. And probably this will be hard for me to say. And I just hate this because when we were at Uncle Buddy's birthday, we were commenting about how good a shape Uncle Buddy was in, and Alan was making the comment, I don't know if I'm ever going to make it to 90 or this, that much. And I was like, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to either, whatever. And I never thought that it would be, 2 weeks would be the last time that we saw one another again, which really makes you think of all the other times and the things that you spent together and the conversations that you have. But the one thing that represents Alan the best to me, that I never will forget, was how upset he was at my sister's death. And at the funeral, the fact that he kept saying continuously, I wish the Lord would rather taken me than her. And the thing is, I think a lot of people would say that. I think Alan's probably the only one that I know that actually meant it. And out of everything that was said to me on that day, that's the thing that stood out is the most prominent and the most important and meant the most to me. Not that I would want that, but the fact that he would even feel that for my sister. But that sums up Alan to me, because throughout my whole life, Alan always put everyone above himself. He always thought about everyone else. And maybe that is kind of the secret to it, because even when he was going through the pain, and I was down there at the hospital when Michelle's dad was in the hospital, he wasn't concerned about himself. When I hung out with him, he was wanting to know how Michelle's dad was doing, and he felt so bad that Michelle's dad was having to go through that. And that's just Alan to me. That's not something that I have, but that's something that he had, and it just shone through. And I'll never forget him for that, and I'll always appreciate that. And I love him, and I'm glad he's my cousin, and I hate that he's no longer here with us, and I'm going to miss not being able to have those conversations and reminisce about my dad, my sister, and all those kind of things. But I know that one day we'll meet again, and I'm just thankful for the time that I had with him while he was here.